Fantastic. I am so happy to be here tonight to talk about Out North, an archive of queer activism and kinship in Canada. This is a book that I wrote with my friend and colleague, Nisha Eswaran. It came out in 2020, and a French version came out in 2022. But to be honest, when the English version came out, it was like the start of the COVID pandemic. It was like just the spring of 2020. And so it didn't feel like a very sort of like joyful or exciting time, of course. And so we didn't get to talk much about this book. So I'm always really happy to get the opportunity to come and chat about this book because it felt like its original launch kind of fizzled. So I'm really happy to be here today. I've prepared about 30 minutes. I'll speak for about 30 minutes about the book, about the archive from which the book comes, and maybe about the broader importance of LGBTQ2 plus history. And then we'll have lots of time for questions. So before I started working on Out North with Nisha, I was a volunteer at the ArQuives, Canada's LGBTQ2 plus archives, located in Toronto. And I was I was a volunteer there for about 8 years. And I felt really fortunate that I got to spend time with this incredible collection and get to work with these materials and get to learn from these historical materials. And that's part of the impetus for the publication of Out North. So one of the goals of Out North is to bring aspects of this particular archival collection to a broader audience, and also to people who maybe don't live down the street from the archive and can't go and do some research there. Nisha and I were hoping to recreate some of these materials and share them with broader audiences. So this archive, it's now called The ArQuives with a Q, Canada's LGBTQ2 plus archives. It's gone through many names. But this archive began in 1973, and it began as an offshoot of The Body Politic, a gay liberation newspaper that was published from 1971 for a few decades. Originally, the purpose of this archive was just to collect material from The Body Politic, because The Body Politic became a real sort of lightning rod for LGBTQ2 plus history in Canada and activism. So they were constantly receiving materials from liberation groups across the country. They were starting to compile that material and also compile all the material that was needed to create these issues of The Body Politic. So that's how this archive started. It was just like a small secondary project to The Body Politic. When it started, it was called the Canadian Gay Liberation Archives. It was subsequently called the Canadian Gay Archives, and then the Canadian Gay and Lesbian Archives, and now the Archives with a Q. But regardless of what its name was, the thing that has kept it going all of these years, since 1973, is that there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of volunteers, people who are just like interested community members who participate in this project of archiving this material and care for this material and ensure the safety of this material and make sure that it's available widely to anyone who's interested in it, to community members, to researchers, to students, to faculty, to journalists, to anyone who wants access to this material. It started in 1973, as I mentioned. When it began, it could fit in one small cardboard box, and it was stored in the shed of a house on Kensington Ave in Kensington Market in Toronto. It has since grown to be the largest LGBTQ2 plus independent archive in the world. So there are some other big LGBTQ2 plus archives, but they're associated with, say, the City of New York or the University of Southern California. They're part of larger institutions. The Archives in Toronto is the largest independent LGBTQ2 plus archive in the entire world. And so there's a few pivotal moments with this archive that I just want to tell you about before we get into the sort of like bulk of the book itself. In 1977, the Toronto police raided the archives. At the time, the archives was located in the same office as the Body Politic. The police came in for an investigation to do with the Body Politic and completely ransacked the archive, took a bunch of materials, kept those materials for more than 8 years, only returned them when they were forced to by the state. And this was like a kind of scary moment for this archive, right? And so ever since that moment, the archive has been kind of distancing itself from the Body Politic and Pink Triangle Press in an effort to protect this material as something separate. There's like questions about the legality of whether the police were allowed to take this material from the archives. For all of the investigations that the body politic faced. They were acquitted on all charges. Um, but the broader kind of danger remained that this material needed to be cared for and protected and collected. And so maybe the archive itself had to become a separate project. And so over the years following this raid in 1977, we start to see the archive become more and more independent until eventually it develops its own board of governors, and it's its own separate thing. Another really important thing that happened to the archive throughout its history is that in 1981, after a really long battle with the Canada Revenue Agency, the archives received charitable status. And so what that meant is that any materials or financial donations given to the archive could be tax exempt, and this allowed for like financial stability in the archive. It's it's interesting, and we can talk about this a bit if you are interested. We can bring it up in the Q&A session. But in the battle in 1981 between the archives and the Canada Revenue Agency, the Revenue Agency kept coming back and saying, no, you can't get charitable status because this is such a niche focus, because this project is so insignificant to sort of like broader cultural societal things. This is just a niche group of people doing something with a niche focus, and so it does not warrant charitable status. And so there was this battle going on in 81. Eventually the archives got it, and now any donations, whether it's material or financial, are tax exempt. So it's been this sort of community of volunteers, community of staff members that have kept this archive going since 1973. In the 1980s, we see many gay and lesbian archives around the world start to close just because of financial pressures. And fortunately, this archive was able to survive and thrive, and it continues to grow to this day. It has 3 locations. The one on your screen is the main location, and this is just southeast of Yonge and Bloor in Toronto. There's a secondary location on Church and Wellesley, and then a third location that's sort of like deep storage. And so that's with a private company, and the bulk of the material is held in a warehouse somewhere near Toronto. I'm not even sure where, and it's protected by this private company. So if you are a researcher who's going to go and do research at this archive, it's important to email first and let them know what you want to see, because there's a chance that some of it might be in deep storage and might need to get pulled. So this is the kind of like beautiful collective archival project that inspired Out North, and Out North as a book really looks specifically at this archive and tries to tell a story through this archival material. Nisha and I open Out North with a chapter that we call Memory Work. It's our introductory chapter, and we just sort of think about the importance of archiving LGBTQ2 plus history, and also the challenges of researching that history, and the challenge of researching histories of any marginalized community that might not have the same amount of evidence or the same type of evidence of existence that non-marginalized communities may have. So Out North attempts to show as much of this collection as we can. It really just scratches the surface because this is such an enormous collection. But it's trying to tell a story of queer formation and queer activism and queer joy in Canada through these archival materials. We start the book in terms of our temporal framing around 1939. So we started just with the start of the Second World War, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But before we get into that temporal focus, we have a few other things that we show. First, we identify a few fun, like queer happenings that happened before 1939. These are just really kind of short snippets about historical moments and historical movements and things that were really interesting to us, but they didn't fit the temporal framework of the book because we had to start it at some point. We had to have like a clear cutoff date. I'll tell you a story about one of these queer happenings pre-1939 because it was something I didn't know, and it was something that was really interesting to me to learn about. It's the story of Dr. James Barry, who I think now we would probably refer to him as trans, right? But at the time, that kind of terminology did not exist, right? He could not identify as trans at the time. That language wasn't there. But he was the Inspector General of Hospitals in Canada throughout the mid 1800s, and this person, Dr. James Barry, developed and designed a number of sanitation systems across Canada. And it's just sort of interesting to think about this because I think, his work likely saved thousands and thousands of lives. He was a really respected doctor. He there's a rumor that he did the first cesarean section in Canada, but then he also designed these sanitation programs that would have kept people healthy and safe. And so the way that they frame his sort of life, his existence, is that he was discovered to be, and what they say is like born a woman by the time of his death. So they realized that he was assigned female at birth, and then he lived his life as a man so that he could move through public and so that he could do this work, this important medical work. And so, well, we may often hear these sorts of critiques of social movements saying like trans stuff is so new and it's just like this new invention. That's often a critique that comes at some of these social movements. I think it's important to remember that there are people that we would consider trans in this moment on this earth since people have walked this earth, and some of them, like Dr. James Barry, are hugely important. So that's just one of the kind of like pre 1939 queer happenings. Another one is about a newspaper that published a report on sodomitical practices in Halifax in 1752. It's the first earliest reference to like someone being arrested for anal sex. It's the first written reference to that. And it's also the first year that that newspaper was printed, and that's the first newspaper printed in Canada. So just sort of little fun tidbits that don't fit the temporal framing of the book. Then we have a chapter called Stashing the Evidence. And this chapter is explicitly about the archives, Canada's LGBTQ2 plus archives. We take this title from an article that was published in 1979 by Rick Bebu called Stashing the Evidence that talked about the importance of this archival project. In this chapter, we trace the history of the archival project and try to give credit to as many volunteers and volunteer collectives as we possibly can who have played a role in this project and in this broader archival collection. The first temporally framed chapter starts in 1939 and it goes until 1971. We call this burgeoning subcultures because it's really like the start of a foundation of LGBTQ2 plus life in Canada. We start with the start of the Second World War, and we go up until the sort of gay liberation movement when things became more overtly political and more aggressive. This is photo for our chapter 2 pages is a group of friends on Hanlan's Point Beach on the Toronto Islands. We took this photograph from the collection of Philip McLeod, who is the third person from the left. His face is kind of covered by the curve of the two, and he donated a lot of materials, including some really detailed journals to the archive. And so we were able to learn about his life and his experience, and we were fortunate that he also donated a lot of photographs. So as we're reading this story through his journals about what he was doing, we also had visual evidence of this and visual representations of the things he was talking about, which was really wonderful. We start this chapter to do with the Second World War because the Second World War was a profound disruption of life, and this really potentialized the kind of queer subcultures that we talk about in this chapter. The Second World War moved millions of Canadians outside of their small towns and their family units, and usually placed them into sex-segregated spaces for sustained periods of time. And a Canadian scholar named Paul Jackson writes about this in his book, One of the Boys, Homosexuality in the Military During World War II. He says that the Second World War was a time of discovery for a lot of soldiers abroad and a lot of laborers at home. And for many people, it served as an education into the fact that they were far from alone in their homosexual desires. And so for a lot of people, this is when the possibility of homosexuality starts to develop, right? And the kind of recognition that, maybe I'm not alone in some of these feelings, like maybe other people feel this as well. This is a letter from Philip McLeod to his family that's held at the archives, and it's quite interesting. He's actually writing it when he just heard over the radio in the trenches that the war was ending. So we're seeing this like on the spot, sort of in the moment typing of this, his sort of realization that the war was ending. So it's a kind of beautiful moment. Although there was a lot of possibility through the sort of mobilization of people during the Second World War, almost immediately afterwards, there's this desire to return to normalcy in the Canadian state, right? In the nation. And heterosexuality and heterosexual families were seen as the building blocks of the nation, right? As something that needed to be protected and supported and encouraged, because that's something that makes a healthy nation. Part of this had to do with worries and anxieties about communism. There was an idea that homosexuals were particularly susceptible to blackmail by foreign agents, and there was this constant fear that that could happen. And so, in the mid 20th century, around 1946, the Canadian government started a security panel on homosexuality. And this was a special section of the RCMP with influence from the military. And their job was to find homosexuals in both the civil service and the Canadian Armed Forces and to kick them out, basically, because of this fear of blackmail that, homosexuals, because they live necessarily secret lives, because they are hiding aspects of themselves, they might be particularly susceptible to blackmail from foreign agents. And so this is when the state actually develops as a project the purging of homosexuals from both the civil service and the Canadian Armed Forces. And there's all sorts of reasons why anxieties around homosexuality develop at this moment. One of the main reasons is that Alfred Kinsey, who is a sexologist, he published a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And in this book, he makes two claims that really shook the nation of Canada and the United States. One was that there are far, far, far more homosexuals in the world than you might imagine. And the second claim that he made was that you can't always tell just by looking at someone that they're homosexual. And so this caused all sorts of anxieties. And the Canadian federal government actually teamed up with a Carleton University professor named Frank Wake. And we've excerpted part of his report here on the yellow page. And what the government asked Wake to do was to develop some sort of machine that could test for homosexuality. And this is, again, influenced by that anxiety that you can't always tell just by looking at someone what their sexuality is. And so Frank Wake comes up with this design for a machine that looks a lot like a dentist chair, actually, but it has a screen in front of it. And the idea is that the machine would monitor someone's perspiration, it would monitor someone's pupils, their pulse rate, their breathing, all these sorts of things. And the screen in front of their face would show different photographs. And the idea was that if they responded to photographs of men and there was a male subject in the chair, then he must be a homosexual and he should be kicked out of the military or he should be kicked out of the civil service. But the problem was that the photographs they used were kind of shocking to all sorts of people. Like it would just be, imagine this, you're sitting in the chair and you've got all these things strapped to your body and they show you a picture of a beautiful fall day in a park and then a picture of maybe clothes on a line drying in the wind. And then they would show you a picture of like a really muscly man who's sweating, and it would be a close up on his chest, and it would just be this really like kind of erotic and loaded image. And the idea was that if that final image made you perspire or made your pupils dilate, then you were proven to be a homosexual. So this was the proposal for this machine. A prototype of this machine was made and it was tested by the RCMP, but it ended up not going into practice because the machine reported that everyone that it tested was gay. So eventually RCMP agents would refuse to volunteer to be a test subject on this machine, and so they weren't able to develop it into a broader kind of project of monitoring homosexuals simply because the machine thought that everyone was gay. So they realized that it would be not the best way to find homosexuals. So at the same time that the state is doing all of this work to try to identify and surveil and contain homosexual communities and homosexual people, we also see the development of a number of networks and popular culture networks around queer performance, queer burlesque, queer music performance. On this slide, you can see Ricky Tick, who was both a drag queen and a burlesque dancer. Her story is really wonderful. She donated the story to the archives alongside some materials, but basically female burlesque dancers made more than male strippers did at the time, and so she wanted to pass as a woman so she could make the big bucks as like a successful burlesque dancer. She was very successful. On the other side, you see Jackie Shane, who's sort of come back into the spotlight recently. Jackie is this incredible musician, incredible voice. She's got a live album recorded at the Sapphire Tavern where you can also hear her talk in between songs. This photo of her is from 1967, and she was hugely popular in Toronto in the late 1960s. We also see the development of specific spaces and venues for homosexual sociality. The music room was a place at 575 Yonge Street, so it's really close to Yonge and Wellesley. And this was a venue, this was a bar that was specifically frequented by homosexuals. There were drag performances and drag competitions. There was a lot of writing about this in the gay press. Like, this was a space that was known. And it's in the early 1960s that these spaces start to develop. In addition to physical spaces, we also see the development of publications and organizations. So Canada's first organized homophile group, and that's sort of the moment of LGBTQ history just before the gay liberation movement. But Canada's first homophile group was the Association for Social Knowledge. They were based in Vancouver, BC. Canada's first publication that included gay in the title was a newspaper called Gay. It started publishing in March of 1964 in Toronto, and it wasn't even the only gay publication that started that year in Toronto. Two, the Homosexual Viewpoint in Canada, also started in Toronto in 1964. And the title Two is a bit of a play on the title of a homophile publication coming out of the States called One, and that was coming out of California. So that's just a play on that. In 1969, when the Stonewall riots were happening in New York City and the Trudeau senior government was liberalizing Canada's criminal code and Canadian society, we also see the development of some of Canada's first gay liberation organizations. This is one of them, the University of Toronto Homophile Association. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see two flyers. The top one's a flyer, the bottom one's a letter. Gerald Moldenhauer put up this flyer. Anyone interested in discussing the organization of a student homophile league, please contact. He put that up when he was working at the University of Toronto as a lab tech in the Department of Biology, I think, the Department of Physiology. When he put up this sign, a few days later, he got this letter saying that he was dismissed. He was fired from his job at the University of Toronto for trying to start the University of Toronto Homophile Association. He still started it, even though he didn't work in that place anymore. So we start out north in this period of time because it's this kind of incredible foundation for what comes later. This is a moment when all of these seeds are being planted about the possibility for homosexual social networks and performance and political organizations. And this really transforms Canadian society. It's really this period that everything changes post-war. The third chapter of the book traces 1971 to 1981, and this is a decade when we see a flurry of activism across Canada, a flurry of really like organized, overt, and aggressive political action. In the book, we talk about the Community Homophile Association of Toronto, or CHAT. We talk about the Gay Alliance Toward Equality, which was based in Vancouver, BC. We talk about the Front de Liberation de Homosexuels in Montreal. We talk about Gays of Ottawa and the Winnipeg Lesbian Society, and many, many more, because 1971 to 1981 is this moment when people were becoming organized and they were becoming sort of public with their desires, with their dreams for liberation. It's also the decade when we see national organizing and national coalitions start to develop among these groups. So in 1971, in August, there was a rally on Parliament Hill. It's often referred to as the We Demand movement because the protesters made a list of demands that they presented to the federal government. In the book, we've reproduced a speech by an activist named Charlie Hill. If you look on the other page, you can also see a photo of him speaking into a microphone holding an umbrella on Parliament Hill. This was an important moment because it was a political action organized by multiple different groups in multiple different cities, and it was a clear set of demands being given to the federal government. It's the same decade that we see national organizing develop. And so activists would get together yearly in different cities around Canada to talk about gay liberation, to talk about problems that they're facing and ideas that they have, and to share their methods and their histories with others who are interested in the project. In many of these cities, the conference would also include a march down the main streets. And so for some of these cities, it was the first Pride March that would have ever happened. And this happened in the 1970s as part of these national conferences. Importantly, the 1970s are also when we see the development of organized trans political action in Canada. So in 1978, Rupert Raj founded the Foundation for the Advancement of Canadian Transsexuals, or FACT, in Calgary, Alberta. This is an important group that went on for decades and decades. Rupert is still writing about this time. He's still telling the story of this, but it was a very important group. And they're just one of the many groups that we cover in this book that have done things of note, things of great importance during the 1970s. And then finally, we end chapter 3 with a discussion of the Toronto bathhouse raids of 1981. And so sometimes this is referred to as Canada's Stonewall by some of the elder activists that I work with at the ArQuives. This was a coordinated police raid of multiple bathhouses in downtown Toronto. Um, at the time, it was the second largest mass arrest in Canadian history, second only to the October crisis in 1970, when Trudeau Sr. invoked the War Measures Act. We talk about this raid because it was quite violent. It was quite brutal. After these raids, which included hundreds of police officers arrested or detained hundreds of gay men, after these raids, there was a City of Toronto Council report on these, and it's kind of chilling to read, but it's a report that exists at the ArQuives. Basically, what the City Council argues is that this was an intentional, coordinated attack on the gay community in an effort to silence them, or at least slow the movement down a little bit. And they point to a number of reasons for why they interpret it this way. It has to do with the damage that was inflicted on these venues, but also the brutality with which the police approached some of these men, some of these detainees. The report also quotes one officer who reportedly said to a group of men who were naked in like a locker room shower, like a gym shower room. According to this report, he said, "I wish these pipes were hooked up to gas so we could annihilate you all." So there was this real kind of like awful, sort of violent and aggressive tone to this report, and that's why the City Council talked about it in the way that they did and had a report done on this. So while we end this chapter with talking about the raids, we start the next chapter, which is chapter 4, and it goes from 1981 to the end of the 1990s. We start the next chapter with the community's response to these raids. As I said, some of the more elder or senior activists that I work with at the ArQuives sometimes refer to this as Canada's Stonewall, because it was this police action that instigated a collective response from both the community sort of involved, or the community that was vulnerable in these attacks, but also other communities as well. So we talk about this collective response to the bathhouse raids. In this chapter, we also talk quite a bit about AIDS and the start of HIV/AIDS, and both political responses to that moment, also artistic responses to that moment. I'll tell you a story because this was one thing I didn't know when I started out north, and I think it's a story that has really stuck with me. On the right side of your screen, you see a woman named Eva Helpert, and that's her father, Elmer, who's sitting in the chair next to her. And this story about Eva Helpert really moved me and really stuck with me. But basically, Eva's son Ivan had AIDS, and his health was going downhill rapidly. Early AIDS medications like AZT wasn't working for Ivan, and a new drug called DDL is how it's usually referred to. It was really his only shot at surviving. And Bristol Myers, a pharmaceutical company based at 390 Bay Street, was refusing to put this out into the world. Ivan even applied for the emergency drug release program, but ultimately the pharmaceutical company still refused to give him this drug. And so in the summer of 1989, every single day for almost 4 months, Eva and her father her father Elmer would protest in front of the pharmaceutical company, and they sort of became sort of unexpected AIDS activists in a kind of beautiful way, and they were able to talk to lots of people when they were protesting, and they really put kind of a human face on this disease that at the time was being dismissed by a lot of people, including a lot of government organizations. We also talk about the formation of a number of identity-based LGBTQ2+ groups that occurred in the 1980s. So this is ZAMI, one of the first organizations in Canada for LGBTQ2 plus people of color. We also talk about Kush, which is a society for South Asian gay men. We talk about OLA, which is a political society and a cultural organization for Spanish-speaking people of Latin descent. And we talk about Gay Asians of Toronto. So all of these groups have people who were involved in the liberation movement before the formation of these groups. But in the 1980s, we see the intentional formation of LGBTQ2 groups around other forms of identity, usually having to do with race or country of origin. And so it's this really interesting moment where politics develop in a new way, and a lot of new people are brought into the collective project as a part of this. We talk about publications like the zines of that are called Gender Trash. These were done by Mira Soleil Ross and Zanzor Phillips McKay in the early 1990s. We look at dance parties and collective music events, including Will Monroe's Vaseline parties that happened in the 1990s as well, in the early 2000s. And then finally, the last temporal chapter of the book is looking into the 21st century and trying to trace these histories to see what's going on now and how groups are building on these histories in really impressive ways. One of our focuses in this chapter is on the globalized kind of world and the globalized reality of LGBTQ life. So we talk about Rainbow Refugees organizations. We talk about ongoing Indigenous organizing, because in the start of the 21st century, we see a lot of really impressive and significant Indigenous organizing, both claiming space in the queer movement, but also reminding people about the ongoing importance of Indigenous politics. We talk about Black Lives Matter and their connection to broader queer and trans political action. And we look at a number of examples where younger generations are building on the movement of the 1970s and 1980s. No More Potlucks was a radio show and then a publication out of Montreal. Video Fag was a performance space and venue in Kensington Market in Toronto. And the Queer Songbook Orchestra are still an active musical group that often perform with more senior or elder LGBTQ members as they sort of rethink music from the past. We also talk about some fun things like this lesbian haunted house called Killjoy's Castle. It sort of traces the history of lesbian feminist activism and organizing, but it does it in a really fun way because you're moving through a haunted house. And we talk about the Unity Mosque, which was an important mosque that now has locations in multiple cities across Canada. It's for queer and trans Muslim people. We talk about how we're kind of in a golden age of trans and two-spirit literature in Canada at the moment, and how fortunate we are. And then finally, we get to the conclusion of the book, which is all about remembering the past. And so one thing Nisha and I do in this conclusion is also talk about other archives in Canada that participate in this broader historical project, because as you'll remember, this book all comes from one archive, but it's just one of many in Canada. There is a trans archive at the University of Victoria. There's a two-spirit archive at the University of Winnipeg. There's a French gay archive in Montreal. There's lots of things going on. And so we try to position this book as like an attempt to talk to all those different projects. Again, this is just sort of a starting point. I think there's many other books that need to be written, and hopefully people will do that. We have an afterword that's provided by some of our mentors, some really important queer activists. They talk about the labor of queer archiving, but also the importance of queer archiving. And now, I just need maybe about one more minute, maybe 2 more minutes, but I want to show you these inserts that we have throughout the book, because the archives, this archive that the book comes out of, they specialize in collecting a few things that are maybe a bit unconventional or a bit odd, but they were vitally important to Nisha and I being able to tell this story in this book. And so the first thing is diaries and journals. You can see some examples here. The archive has an incredible collection of handwritten or hand-typed journals from people in the 50s, 60s, and on. This was really important for us to learn about the sort of everyday life of some of these people in order to tell this story. The archive also collects matchbooks, which might seem a bit odd in our current moment, but before the invention and the popularization of the Bic lighter, and when smoking was even more common, Matchbooks were a really useful way for getting to know the queer possibilities or the queer collectivity in the cities that you existed in. A lot of businesses and social organizations or community organizations would use these as like little billboards that people would walk around with in their pockets. And so there's an incredible collection of matchbooks held at the archives that traces this history. Pulp fiction was for a long time one of the only representations of queerness that you could get easily. And so these books would be sold at whatever the equivalent of Shoppers was in the 1960s and 1950s. The covers that you see on your screen, this is a collection of lesbian pulp fiction that is collected by the archives. It's a very formulaic style of writing. Usually what happens is that some sort of evil, sinister lesbian tricks some straight woman into becoming a lesbian, and then there's some danger, and eventually at the end of the novel, the woman goes back to being straight and she's safe again and everything is good again. So it's a very formulaic kind of writing that we see being very popular in the 1960s, and this is just some of the collection that the archives has. They also collect t-shirts, pornography and erotica, pin buttons, and oral histories. I'm going to pause on oral histories for a minute because what these are recordings of people, many of whom are no longer with us, telling their story and telling us memories about their lives, right? And so these are really, really important objects that hold these stories. The archives has compiled a number of collections from different projects, and there's a really rich history here, a really rich collection of oral history recordings. And finally, the archives also collects these gay guidebooks. These are very like pre-internet. If you were going somewhere and didn't know anything about the city, this was an opportunity to learn before you got there. My favorite is, of course, the one with the title A Guide for the Naive Homosexual. But the archives has a really phenomenal collection of these. These started being published in the late 1960s, and the archives has some for all cities. So that's just sort of an introduction to this book. Thank you for letting me share this book with you. As I said, when it was released originally, the launch kind of fizzled, and so I didn't really get a chance to talk about this book, so I'm really happy to. I do just want to make clear that I've only shown, a very small portion of what's in the book during this presentation tonight, and the book itself shows a very small portion of what's in the archives, and so I encourage all of you, if you have the chance, to go to the archives and see this material for yourself. So thank you very much.